This channel is usually focused on books, breaking them down, analyzing their themes, and helping you decide whether they're worth your time and money. But every once in a while, something comes along that falls outside the traditional definition of a book while still demanding the same level of serious analysis. This 192-page post-election report is one of those cases. It's a document that most people are interested in, and it makes major claims about one of the most consequential political defeats in recent history. So for this video, I'm making a slight shift in format, not to review a book, but to analyze a report that I believe is worth examining closely. With that said, let's get started. Post-election political reports are supposed to do something straightforward. Explain what happened, identify mistakes, offer lessons, help the losing side avoid repeating those same failures. That, at least, is the theory. What makes this particular report worth examining is that it attempts to do exactly that after one of the most consequential presidential losses in recent Democratic history. But it also raises a larger question. Did the Democratic Party actually learn the right lessons from 2024? Or is this document, in some ways, repeating the same institutional habits that helped create the loss in the first place? That's what we're unpacking today. This is a 192-page post-election report tied to Democratic analysis of the 2024 election. And before we go any further, one important note. The document itself includes a disclaimer stating that many of its underlying assertions were not independently verified by the DNC. That matters. But for purposes of this discussion, what matters even more is this. What does this report reveal about how Democratic insiders explain the loss? Because regardless of whether you agree with every conclusion, the document offers a revealing look into how at least part of the Democratic political ecosystem interprets what happened. And after reading it carefully, my conclusion is fairly direct. This report identifies real strategic failures, but even where it tries to distribute responsibility across systems, advisors, messaging teams, and institutional weaknesses, the central accountability still points to leadership. And in a presidential campaign, leadership has a name: Kamala Harris. Now, let me be clear, this is not going to be a casual Kamala bad analysis. That would be intellectually lazy. Nor is this going to be an exercise in pretending she was merely a passive victim of circumstances around her. That would be equally unserious. Presidential campaigns are leadership tests. If the strategy succeeds, the nominee gets the credit. If it collapses, the nominee owns the failure. That is how leadership works. And one of the interesting tensions inside this report is that it spends significant time describing structural failures around Harris, while unintentionally reinforcing the reality that leadership accountability remains with her. That tension runs throughout the entire document, and it starts surprisingly early, because one of the first major arguments the report makes is not actually about Trump. It's not even really about the election itself. It's about preparation, or more specifically, a lack of preparation. Here's one of the more striking passages. The White House did not position or prepare the vice president. That is not subtle language. That is a direct accusation, and the report expands on it. It argues that while research was conducted to better understand how other political figures within the administration could support President Biden, no comparable strategic groundwork was meaningfully built around Kamala Harris as a future national nominee. That is an extraordinary claim, because vice presidents are not political accessories. They are the most obvious succession figure in American politics. If the report is correct, then Democratic leadership failed to systematically prepare its own vice president for the possibility of national leadership. That's not a minor oversight. That's institutional failure. But this is where I want to make something clear. Even if that criticism is entirely fair, it does not remove responsibility from Harris, because leadership accountability is not transferable. If you believe her political preparation was insufficient, the obvious question becomes, why? Was she politically passive? Did she fail to build her own strategic infrastructure? Did she fail to demand better preparation? Did she fail to recognize her own weaknesses? Because ultimately, serious political figures are not simply prepared by others. They prepare themselves. So even here, where the report seems to place blame outward, the accountability still circles back inward. And then we get to one of the most discussed lines in the report. Any fair critic of the vice president has to acknowledge the strength and ability she demonstrated as the nominee. That sentence deserves attention, because it is doing something important. The authors are acknowledging that criticism of Harris should not become caricature. Fair enough. But the obvious question is, what exactly are those strengths? The report implies several: composure under pressure, political resilience, the ability to assume the nomination under intense scrutiny, the ability to keep the race competitive. That's the charitable interpretation. And some of that is probably true. But this is where my own analysis diverges from the softer reading, because resilience alone is not competence. Endurance is not persuasion. Surviving a campaign is not the same as effectively leading one. And the rest of this report makes that distinction unavoidable, because while it briefly acknowledges Harris's strength and ability, the overwhelming weight of the document points towards strategic failure. And if you are the nominee, strategic failure is your burden to carry. Now, before we go deeper into Harris specifically, we need to talk about Trump, because no serious analysis of 2024 can avoid him. And this report does something politically revealing in how it frames him. It repeatedly suggests Democrats failed to define Trump effectively for voters, that they assumed his negatives were already fully understood, that his political liabilities were already priced in, that voters needed less reminding. If true, that would be a major strategic miscalculation, because elections are not fought against historical memory. They're fought against present perception, and perception changes. Economic anxiety changes perception. Political fatigue changes perception. Media saturation changes perception. Time changes perception. The Trump many Democratic strategists believed voters remembered may not have been the Trump voters were emotionally evaluating in 2024. That distinction matters enormously, and the report says this directly. The inability to impact Trump's favorability was a major failure of the campaign. That's a serious indictment. Not of outside forces, of the campaign itself. And once you accept that premise, another uncomfortable question emerges. Who was running that campaign? Because again, strategy is not some abstract weather system. Strategy reflects leadership. Now here's where the analysis becomes more politically uncomfortable, because the report does not merely argue Trump was underestimated. It argues Harris herself was never clearly defined. That may be the single most damaging strategic criticism in the document, because if voters cannot quickly answer, who is this candidate? What does she stand for? Why should I trust her? Why is she different? You have a major political problem. And according to this report, Democrats never solved that problem. The critique becomes even sharper here. The report suggests Harris's messaging leaned too heavily on opposition to Trump rather than affirmative candidate definition. That matters, because anti-opponent messaging can energize partisans. But presidential elections are not won on negative definition alone. Candidates must also create a compelling affirmative case. The report strongly suggests Harris failed to do that. And frankly, I think that criticism has weight, because whatever one thinks politically, one of Harris's long-standing vulnerabilities has been message clarity. She has often struggled to project a simple, durable political identity that resonates with broad national audiences. That problem did not begin in 2024, and the report strongly suggests it was never solved. Now here's where some viewers may say, wait, wasn't the campaign unusually compressed? Yes, that's true. But again, context explains, it does not excuse. Leadership means adapting under imperfect conditions, and if the candidate cannot adapt effectively, that is still a candidate problem. Now we arrive at one of the report's most politically explosive themes: male voters. This section is particularly striking because the report compares Harris not primarily against Republicans, but against fellow Democrats. That comparison matters because it removes some obvious excuses. Same national climate, same election cycle, same broader environment, different outcomes. The report points specifically to Josh Stein in North Carolina, and it makes this claim: Stein won 51% of men, while Harris won 40%. Now, whether every precise metric in the report holds up perfectly is a separate question. The broader political point is what matters. The report believes Harris had a significant male voter problem. That is not a small issue. that is potentially election-defining. And if true, it raises a direct question about political connection, because campaigns do not lose major voter blocks by accident. That usually reflects messaging failures, cultural disconnect, candidate weakness, or some combination of all three. And this is where I think the report is strongest, because even where specific numbers can be debated, the larger conclusion feels credible. Harris did not connect broadly enough with the electorate she needed, and once that becomes true, the rest of the map becomes much harder, because the report doesn't stop with male voters. Next, it goes after rural strategy, and that's where the criticism becomes much sharper, because the argument is no longer simply that Harris underperformed. It's that Democrats may have strategically abandoned parts of the country they could no longer afford to ignore. And if that argument holds, the 2024 defeat starts looking less like a campaign failure and more like the culmination of a much longer political decline. So, let's pick up there, because this is where the report stops making isolated criticisms and starts building a much larger argument. And that argument is not simply that Kamala Harris ran an imperfect campaign. It's that the campaign misread the electorate in fundamental ways. That is a much more serious accusation, because campaigns can survive tactical mistakes. Bad ad buys, weak debate moments, poor interview choices. Those things happen. But when a campaign fundamentally misunderstands the voters it needs to persuade, the damage is much harder to contain. And according to this report, that is exactly what happened. The next major line of attack is rural America, and the report's language here is not subtle. It essentially argues that Democrats have developed a political strategy that assumes urban and suburban strength can compensate for catastrophic weakness elsewhere. That's not just a tactical criticism. That's a criticism of the party's electoral worldview. Here's the relevant framing. The math doesn't work. You can't lose rural areas by overwhelming margins and make it up elsewhere when rural voters are a significant share of the electorate. That's a direct strategic warning, and I think it deserves serious attention, because whether one agrees politically with rural voters is irrelevant. Electoral math does not care about emotional preferences. If millions of voters are moving decisively against you, that matters. And if your nominee cannot meaningfully reduce those losses, that matters even more. Now let me be careful here. No one is arguing Harris needed to win rural America. That's unrealistic. The question is whether she needed to perform less badly there. And the report clearly believes the answer is yes. That brings us back to leadership, because this is where political analysis often becomes evasive. People talk about the campaign, the messaging, the operation. But those are abstractions. Campaigns are led by actual decision makers. Someone decides where resources go. Someone decides messaging priorities. Someone decides coalition strategy. Someone decides which voter groups receive emphasis. And in presidential politics, that accountability ultimately points upward. If the rural strategy failed, Harris owns that. If her campaign chose the wrong coalition assumptions, Harris owns that. That may sound harsh, but that is exactly how leadership accountability works. Now here's where the report becomes particularly revealing, because it repeatedly compares Harris against Democratic candidates who outperformed her. That's politically damaging, because once that comparison exists, the excuse that the national environment made victory impossible becomes harder to sustain. The report's implicit argument becomes other Democrats found stronger pathways with similar voters. Why didn't Harris? That is a difficult question, and the report does not shy away from it. Now let's talk about one of the most politically consequential themes in the document: enthusiasm. This is where campaign professionals often use sanitized language. Turnout dynamics, participation deficits, mobilization underperformance. But stripped of jargon, the issue is simpler. Did enough people actually want to vote for her? That's the real question. And the report's answer appears to be not enough. It specifically focuses on irregular voters, new voters, and turnout assumptions. Here's one of the sharper claims. Harris fell below 50% with new voters for the first time in modern Democratic history. Now again, exact data claims deserve scrutiny, but But let's focus on the broader political meaning. The report is saying the coalition Democrats expected to energize did not respond as expected. That is a major problem because Democratic presidential math often depends heavily on turnout enthusiasm from newer, younger, less consistent, and urban-heavy voting groups. If that coalition underperforms, the margins get ugly quickly. And if the nominee fails to inspire turnout among the very voters expected to be energized, that is not just an organizational problem. That is a candidate problem. This is where some Harris defenders will argue, well, turnout challenges are always multi-factor. Of course they are. That's true. But leadership accountability does not disappear because causation is complex. If the coalition fails to materialize, the nominee cannot be exempt from responsibility. That's the standard. Now let's get to something even more politically uncomfortable: connection. Because underneath all the strategy language, this report keeps circling the same core issue. Kamala Harris did not connect broadly enough with the electorate, not simply ideologically, emotionally. That distinction matters. Voters are not spreadsheets. They are emotional decision makers, rational in some ways, reactive in others. If a candidate feels distant, scripted, unclear, or politically manufactured, that matters. And I think the report repeatedly points toward exactly that concern. Not always explicitly, but unmistakably. The male voter discussion points there. The rural discussion points there. The turnout discussion points there. The messaging discussion points there. All roads keep returning to the same issue: connection or the absence of it. Now, to be fair, some of this predates 2024. Harris has faced this criticism for years: difficulty establishing a clean political identity, difficulty creating memorable message discipline, difficulty converting competence into broad voter enthusiasm. Those concerns didn't suddenly appear because of one election, but the report strongly suggests the campaign failed to solve them. And again, if the campaign failed to solve them, that is ultimately leadership failure. Now let's turn back to Trump, because this is where the report becomes particularly revealing, not just about the election, but about Democratic strategic assumptions. The report argues Democrats failed to effectively define Trump for the electorate, that they assumed his negatives were already universally understood, that repeating those attacks would produce diminishing returns. And that assumption, according to the report, was a major strategic mistake. This is the relevant passage. The idea Trump's negatives were baked in is a major failure of analysis and reality. That is extremely direct language, and politically, it's a devastating criticism. Because if the campaign misunderstood how voters were emotionally processing Trump, then the strategic architecture may have been flawed from the beginning. Now here's the key question: who made that miscalculation? Strategists, pollsters, advisors, campaign leadership? The honest answer is probably some combination. But again, presidential campaigns are not democracies. The nominee is not a bystander. If the campaign's core theory was wrong, leadership owns that failure. And I think this is where some political commentary becomes too forgiving. People often describe campaigns as though candidates are passive vessels, as though strategies are imposed upon them, as though nominees simply inherit bad advice. That's incomplete. Strong candidates shape strategy. Strong candidates override bad instincts. Strong candidates recognize political danger. Strong candidates course correct. If none of that happens, accountability remains where it belongs. Now there's another fascinating dimension to this report. It repeatedly tries to explain failure through systems, institutional weaknesses, strategic assumptions, structural decline, messaging architecture. All of that matters. But I kept coming back to a simpler question. If Harris was truly the strongest available Democratic nominee, why does so much of this report read like an explanation for why the candidate couldn't overcome the environment? That itself is revealing, because genuinely strong national candidates often reshape environments. They don't merely react to them. Now, perhaps the harshest implication in the report is this: the election may have been winnable. That is brutal, because losing to an overwhelming force is one thing. Losing a race your own internal analysis suggests was winnable, that creates blame wars. And you can feel that energy throughout this document. Not always explicitly, but clearly. Who failed? The White House, the messaging team, the advisors, the pollsters, the party, Harris. That tension is everywhere. And in my view, while the report attempts to distribute responsibility broadly, the political logic keeps narrowing back toward leadership. But here's where the analysis gets bigger, because at a certain point, the report stops focusing narrowly on Harris and starts making a much larger claim that the Democratic Party's problems didn't begin in 2024, that this loss was years in the making, and that may be the most consequential argument in the entire document. Because if that's true, then Harris didn't simply lose an election. She became the face of a much deeper institutional decline. And this is where the report becomes significantly more ambitious, because up to this point, you could reasonably interpret the document as a campaign autopsy, a review of tactical mistakes, messaging failures, candidate weaknesses, bad strategic assumptions. That would be normal. But the report does something much bigger. It argues that 2024 was not simply a failed campaign. It argues that 2024 was the visible outcome of a much longer decline. That's a far more serious claim, because if true, then the loss cannot be explained simply by Kamala Harris. It would mean the Democratic Party entered the election carrying accumulated structural weaknesses that had been building for years. Now, I want to be precise here. Explaining broader party weakness is not the same thing as removing candidate accountability. Those are different conversations. And one of the mistakes political analysts often make is confusing context with absolution. A weak institution can absolutely make victory harder, but a presidential nominee is still accountable for the campaign they lead. Both things can be true. And this report attempts to make exactly that larger structural case. One of its most consequential arguments is that Democrats have spent years losing connection with working Americans. That is not a casual observation. That is an identity-level critique. Because whatever else one believes about the Democratic Party, its historical self-image has long been tied to labor, workers, and economic advocacy. So when the report argues that connection has deteriorated, it is effectively saying the party has drifted away from one of its defining political relationships. That's not just strategy, that's political identity. And here's the language. We have lost the confidence we once received from everyday Americans. That is a remarkable sentence, because it doesn't describe a temporary tactical failure. It describes erosion, loss of trust, loss of connection, loss of political legitimacy. Now, viewers will absolutely disagree on why that happened. Some will say messaging, some will say policy, some will say cultural issues, some will say media distortion. That debate can go in 100 directions, but the report's larger point is unmistakable. The party believes it has a relationship problem, and if that diagnosis is even partially correct, then 2024 becomes more understandable. Because presidential elections are not merely ideological contests. They are trust contests. If voters do not trust you or no longer feel culturally aligned with you, policy arguments alone often are not enough. Now, the report takes this even further. It explicitly suggests the party has been strategically weakening itself for years. It points backward to Obama-era political high points and argues Democrats failed to convert presidential victories into durable institutional strength. That's a fascinating argument because it reframes what many casual observers think of as success. The report's logic is essentially winning the White House is not the same as building a durable governing coalition. And if you fail to build beneath the headline victory, eventually the weakness becomes visible. That's a serious political argument. Now, whether every detail of that historical analysis is perfect is another matter. But the broader strategic point has merit. Political parties that focus too heavily on national optics while losing local infrastructure eventually pay a price. And the report clearly believes Democrats have been paying that price. Now, this is where I want to return to Kamala Harris, because some viewers may be tempted at this point to conclude, well, if the party itself was structurally weakened, maybe she never really had a chance. I understand that argument. I do, but I don't accept it as exculpatory. Because presidential leadership is precisely about confronting difficult political terrain. Candidates do not get to claim the environment was imperfect and therefore accountability dissolves. Strong leaders recognize institutional weakness and adapt. Strong leaders overcome strategic limitations. Strong leaders compensate. If they fail to do that, then the environment explains the difficulty, but not the outcome, and that distinction matters. Now let's talk about one of the most revealing and frankly bizarre aspects of this report, its incompleteness. Because this is not a trivial issue. This is a 192-page document intended to help explain one of the most consequential presidential defeats in modern democratic politics. And yet, Portions of it are incomplete, not implied, not loosely unfinished, literally incomplete, marked pending. That deserves scrutiny. Because if the purpose of this report is institutional self-assessment, strategic clarity, and honest diagnosis, why are critical sections unfinished? That is not a rhetorical question. It genuinely matters. Because this becomes more than a formatting issue. It becomes symbolic. Think about the broader narrative this report is trying to construct. The Democratic Party lost because of incomplete strategy, incomplete voter connection, incomplete political preparation, incomplete message discipline. And now the report designed to explain those failures arrives with its own incomplete sections. That is difficult to ignore. And yes, I think that criticism is entirely fair. Because the obvious question becomes, is this merely sloppy execution? Or does the incompleteness reflect the same institutional hesitation the report itself criticizes? And an even sharper question follows. Were some conclusions left unfinished because the party is reluctant to fully confront certain internal realities? That's speculative, of course, but it's not an irrational question because serious institutional diagnosis requires completeness, candor, precision, clarity. If the diagnosis itself feels unfinished, confidence naturally suffers, and frankly, that becomes part of the story, because now the report is not merely describing institutional dysfunction, it may be reflecting it. Now let's return to Harris one final time, because after all the structural analysis, all the institutional critique, all the broader democratic introspection, the practical political question remains simple. Could stronger leadership at the top have changed the outcome? I think the report unintentionally suggests yes. That's what makes it so politically revealing. Because despite all the outward blame distribution, the document repeatedly identifies issues that ultimately land at candidate leadership. Message definition, voter connection, strategic judgment, coalition management, Trump positioning, male voter weakness, rural weakness, turnout underperformance. Those are not peripheral campaign details. Those are core presidential campaign functions. And if they failed, the nominee owns meaningful responsibility. Now, some viewers will say, but campaigns are team efforts? Of course they are. That's true. But team efforts still have leadership. No one excuses a failed CEO because advisors made bad recommendations. No one excuses a failed commander because staff performed poorly. Leadership means judgment. Leadership means ownership. Leadership means accountability, and by that standard, Harris cannot be reduced to merely someone surrounded by weak structures. She was the nominee, the principal decision maker, the face of the campaign, and the outcome belongs to her. Now, that does not mean Trump deserves no credit. Far from it. In fact, one of the more revealing aspects of this report is how strongly it suggests Democrats fundamentally misjudged him, not morally, strategically. That distinction matters because love him or hate him, political durability matters, narrative control matters, voter connection matters. Trump retained enough political strength to win. That is simply factual. And if Democrats underestimated that, it becomes part of their failure. Now let's land this. Is this report worth taking seriously? Yes, absolutely. Not because every conclusion should be accepted uncritically, not because every claim is beyond dispute, not because the document is flawless, it clearly is not, but because it reveals something important. It reveals how at least part of the Democratic political establishment explains the 2024 defeat. And in doing so, it reveals where they believe the failures occurred. Some of those critiques are compelling, some are weaker, some raise as many questions as they answer. But taken together, the broader picture is clear. This was not framed as bad luck. It was framed as strategic failure. And in my view, that conclusion is difficult to dismiss. The only place I differ from the report is where accountability becomes too diffuse, because systems matter, institutions matter, historical context matters, but presidential campaigns remain leadership exercises, and leadership ultimately has a name: Kamala Harris. So if the Democratic Party wants to honestly understand 2024, the conversation cannot stop at structural explanations. It must also confront candidate leadership failure directly, and perhaps the most revealing irony of all is this: a report intended to explain why the party lost appears, in some ways, to reflect the same incompleteness it seeks to diagnose. If that observation is fair, then the Democratic Party's real challenge may be larger than one failed campaign. It may be whether it is fully capable of honest institutional self-correction. And that is a much bigger question than 2024. Thank you for watching and spending this time with me. If you enjoyed this analysis and found value in the discussion, I'd appreciate you considering a like and subscribing to the channel. It genuinely helps. And while today's video was a departure from the usual format, we'll be returning to more in-depth book reviews ahead, breaking down stories, ideas, and thought-provoking works to help you decide what's truly worth reading. I look forward to having you back for the next one.